The compact of human worlds had held 9 settled systems for 214 years. It was not the largest human polity that had ever existed, and it was not the strongest. It was, by the numbers kept in the compact's own founding charter, the most stubborn. That charter had been written in the language of expansion, trade routes, terraforming schedules, population targets. Nowhere in its 200 pages did it mention what the compact would do if it were attacked by something larger than itself. For 214 years, that omission had not mattered. Then it did. In the 11 months before this story begins, 6 of the compact's 9 systems burned. The Skarn Dominion did not conquer worlds. Dominion doctrine, translated years earlier by a conquered linguist and filed without much attention in an archive nobody expected to need, stated the principle plainly. A defeated species that is allowed to remain is a species that is allowed to remember. The Dominion did not occupy territory. It erased the name from the list and moved to the next one. Corran Vale fell in 14 days. It had a population of 2 million and a defense fleet of 6 frigates, and the Dominion assessment of the engagement afterward described the outcome as expected within acceptable parameters. Asai's reach fell in 9 days. It had no defense fleet at all, only a planetary militia armed with equipment 3 generations out of date, and its fall was recorded in Dominion logs with the same flat administrative tone as its predecessor. New Kolkata was different on paper. It was the second largest human world, home to 60 million people, and its defense fleet was 3 times the size of anything else in the compact, 41 warships, a number the compact's military command had been proud of for a decade. New Kolkata fell in 26 days. It was the longest resistance the Dominion campaign had encountered anywhere, and Dominion command noted the figure with something that, in a species capable of surprise, might have been called surprise. Between New Kolkata and Kythe's Hold, the compact lost something else that did not appear in any casualty report: its own confidence in the shape of the war. Command staff on the Central Defense Council had spent the previous decade building doctrine around fleet size, believing that the difference between holding a world and losing one was measured in hulls and firepower. New Kolkata's 41 warships had been the largest human fleet ever assembled, and New Kolkata had still fallen faster, proportionally, than Corran Vale's 6 frigates might have suggested it should. Nobody on the council had a satisfying explanation for why. The uncomfortable answer, which several officers privately suspected and none said aloud in the after-action briefings, was that raw fleet strength had never been the variable that mattered, and that the compact had spent 10 years optimizing for the wrong number. That left Kythe's Hold. Kythe's Hold was not chosen for defense. Nobody had built it to withstand anything. It was a mining colony, silicate extraction mostly, with a secondary export in rare earth ore that had never made anyone particularly rich. Its population was 340,000. Its garrison consisted of 4 destroyers old enough that 2 of them had been scheduled for decommission before the war started, and 2,200 soldiers who had spent most of their careers on pirate interdiction along the outer trade lanes, not on anything resembling a Dominion battle fleet. It conquered the wider alliance of non-human species that had, throughout the 11-month campaign, done nothing but watch. Maintained a small observation platform in high orbit above every contested system. Its staff kept internal assessments, updated after each engagement, filed for the Alliance archive and for no one else. The internal assessment for Kythe's Hold, recovered later from the platform's logs, gave the colony 11 days. Kythe's Hold held for 163 days. The Concord's own internal projections for Kythe's Hold were not cruel. They were simply consistent with everything the Alliance had observed in the preceding 11 months. 6 worlds, 6 outcomes, all falling within a narrow band of days that Dominion doctrine had apparently perfected over whatever campaigns had come before this one. Campaigns no human had ever heard of, and no conquered officer discussed in detail. Kythe's Hold, with its 4 aging destroyers and its mining colony garrison, did not read on paper like an exception to that pattern. It read like the 7th confirmation of it. This is the story of how it was not, and it does not begin with a battle. It begins the way most things that matter actually begin, with a transfer order, a filing cabinet, and a woman nobody had bothered to ask any questions about yet. Sergeant Mara Voss transferred into the Kythe's Hold garrison 8 days before the Dominion fleet entered the system. The transfer had not been requested by anyone at Kythe's Hold. It had been arranged by a logistics officer on the Compact's Central Command staff, who was, by his own later account, simply trying to find a place for a soldier whose file did not fit anywhere else. Colonel Priya Anand, who had commanded the Kythe's Hold garrison for 6 years and reviewed every incoming transfer file personally, read Voss's file twice before the shuttle carrying her had even entered the system. The first read produced a number that did not sit correctly alongside the rest of the document. Voss's record showed no prior command experience. It showed no combat commendations. It showed a demolitions specialization, competent but unremarkable, and command time limited to a 4-person engineering team assigned to civilian infrastructure repair. The kind of posting given to soldiers who were reliable but not expected to do anything extraordinary. And then, at the bottom of the record, in a section flagged for verification rather than approval, it stated that Sergeant Mara Voss had been the last confirmed human combatant to leave the surface of New Kolkata, 26 days after the garrison's official destruction had already been logged, and 6 days after every other surviving unit had been evacuated or accounted for. Anand read that line 3 times. Then she requested the verification file that had generated the flag. The verification came back within the hour, filed by a New Kolkata evacuation coordinator who had, in her own account, assumed Voss was dead until a distress beacon activated in a section of tunnel that ground forces had already marked as cleared. Voss had spent those additional 20 days alone in the collapsed maintenance tunnels beneath New Kolkata's capital mining district. The same kind of infrastructure she had spent her career quietly repairing, rigging demolition, charges into support structures the Dominion advance would eventually need to pass through. Each detonation had delayed the ground assault by roughly 6 hours. On their own, none of those delays had changed New Kolkata's outcome. New Kolkata still fell. But Voss had kept fighting a war that everyone else, including her own command structure, had already recorded as finished. She did not mention any of this on her arrival at Kythe's Hold. She reported to the garrison's quartermaster stores, drew a standard field kit, filled out the paperwork correctly on the first attempt, and asked, without any particular urgency in her voice, where the colony's tunnel maps were kept. The quartermaster, a corporal who had not read her file and had no reason to, told her the maps were in the Mining Authority's Civil Engineering Office, 3 corridors over, and thought nothing further of the conversation. Voss was carrying, in a case she did not open in front of anyone, a rifle sling that had belonged to her father. It was tagged with a unit designation from a conflict that had ended before she was born, the fabric worn soft at the buckle from 3 decades of handling. She had carried it through New Kolkata's tunnels without ever attaching it to a weapon. She carried it now for the same reason, whatever that reason was. She had not explained it to anyone, and no one at Kythe's Hold yet knew to ask. Colonel Anand did ask once on Voss's second day. In the kind of offhand question, a commanding officer asks a new transfer to establish rapport rather than to extract information. Voss answered the way she answered most things, briefly, factually, without inviting further conversation. "It was my father's," she said. "He didn't need it where he ended up." Anand did not press for the rest of that sentence. She had read enough of Voss's file by then to recognize the shape of a story being offered in the smallest possible piece on purpose. And she had learned, over 6 years commanding a garrison, that soldiers who rationed their own history that carefully usually had good reasons for the ration. She let the conversation end there and returned to the tunnel maps, which by that point had become the only subject Voss seemed willing to discuss at any length. The Concord maintained a small liaison staff on every world it observed, 3 officers per station, present strictly to record the engagement for the Alliance archive, not to participate in it. Concord policy called this neutrality. In practice, neutrality meant watching a species lose carefully and writing down exactly how. The senior liaison assigned to Kythe's Hold was a Tessari officer named Oren Kessa. Kessa had observed 4 of the previous 6 engagements before this posting, and had, by the Concord's own internal transfer notes, developed what her superiors described as a settled opinion on the outcome of human engagements generally. She was not the kind of officer who volunteered that opinion loudly. She simply asked the question that revealed it, in the tone that certain officers use when they have already decided the answer and are asking only so the record shows they asked. The question came on the second day of the siege, in a command briefing convened to review the garrison's defensive posture ahead of the Dominion fleet's expected arrival. Colonel Anand had assembled her senior staff around the same glass tactical table that had, until recently, only ever been used for shipping schedules and mining permit disputes. Kessa sat at the far end, posture composed, expression giving away nothing that the words themselves did not already give away. "Your estimate for holding this position," Kessa said, "in days." The room did the thing that rooms do when a hierarchy is being enforced without anyone raising their voice. Several of the human staff exchanged glances, not hostile, not even particularly offended, just the specific look of people recalculating their own confidence downward in real time because someone more certain than them had just spoken. Kessa was not being cruel. She had watched 6 worlds fall in 11 months and was extending the same courtesy to Kythe's Hold that she had extended to all of them. An honest assessment, delivered without theater. Colonel Anand said nothing. She had read Sergeant Voss's file 3 times by that point, and she had a specific reason for staying silent that had nothing to do with not having an answer. Several officers began, carefully, to construct an answer that split the difference. An estimate somewhere between the 11 days Kessa's tone implied and the open-ended hope that command briefings tend to default to when no one wants to say a hard number out loud. One of the garrison's fleet captains started to speak, offering a projection built around the 4 destroyers' remaining fuel reserves and estimated engagement tempo, a number that would have sounded, to a room full of professionals, like a reasonable compromise. It was Voss, seated at the far corner of the table, present only because she had been the one to bring the tunnel schematics into the room in the first place, who spoke next, before the fleet captain finished the sentence. "That's a fair question," Voss said, in the tone of someone who found it genuinely fair rather than pointed. She did not look up from the schematic in front of her. "You want the compact's official estimate or mine?" Well, Kessa said the official estimate would be sufficient for the record. 11 days is the official estimate, Voss said. She picked up a stylus and began marking collapse points along the tunnel schematic's main access shaft, unhurried, the way someone marks a document they have already planned out in their head and are simply transcribing. "Mine is longer." Kessa asked how much longer. Voss did not answer that part. She finished marking the 3rd collapse point, set the stylus down, and looked up at the room for the first time since the meeting began, not at Kessa specifically, but at the table generally, the way someone looks up when they consider a topic closed rather than unresolved. The silence that followed was not agreement. Nobody in that room believed in that moment that Voss's estimate would prove correct. It was the sound of several officers, including Kessa, privately deciding to wait and see rather than press further, the particular silence of people who have decided a disagreement is not worth having yet, because the facts have not arrived to settle it either way. What followed over the next 161 days was not, in the words of the conquered archive later assembled from platform recordings and garrison logs, dramatic in the way that Dominion campaign footage from the previous 6 worlds had been dramatic. There were no rousing speeches. There was no single decisive battle. It was procedural, almost administrative, one filed report after another, and it added up to something the Dominion had not encountered in 11 months of otherwise uniform success. Day 9. The Dominion's first ground assault arrived exactly on the schedule that New Kolkata's collapse pattern had predicted, 6 hours to secure surface access to the capital's mining district, according to Dominion planning documents recovered afterward. 11 transport craft descended toward the district's main access shaft in tight formation, the same formation that had worked without variation on 6 previous worlds. Voss was already in position. She had spent her first 8 days at Kythe's hold doing nothing that appeared in any official log, walking the tunnel network with the mining authority's civil engineers, asking questions about load-bearing structures that the engineers found strange but not alarming, and rigging a single primary charge into the shaft's main support column. When the transports were fully committed to their descent, she triggered it. The collapse took all 11 transports. Dominion engineering teams spent 4 days clearing the debris before the ground advance could resume at all 4 days in which nothing else happened. No further assault, no countermove, simply Skarn work crews methodically excavating rock that Voss had put there on purpose. Day 14. Dominion Command, having lost 11 transports to what its own reports described as an unremarkable mining colony with no meaningful defense fleet, ordered a second ground assault along a different approach vector, avoiding the collapse shaft entirely. This assault succeeded in reaching the surface without incident, and Dominion forces spent 3 days establishing a foothold on Kythe's hold's northern continent. Methodically, the way 6 previous campaigns had trained them to expect success would go. Voss, watching the foothold's construction from a ridge 2 kilometers out with a pair of borrowed field glasses, made no move to interfere with it. Her later explanation to Colonel Anand, when asked why, was simple. The foothold sat directly above a section of tunnel network she had not finished reinforcing, and a garrison that destroyed every Dominion position on site, indiscriminately, would run out of charges and options long before the Dominion ran out of transports. She was choosing which fights were worth having, and this was not yet one of them. Day 23. A second charge, smaller and less centrally placed than the first, brought down a section of tunnel beneath a forward staging depot the Dominion had established on the colony's outskirts. The depot's loss was minor in material terms, some fuel stores, a handful of vehicles, no personnel casualties reported. Kessa's after-action note on the incident, recovered later from the Concord archive, read only, anomalous. Recommend continued observation. It was the first time in 6 campaigns that a Concord liaison had used the word anomalous to describe anything a human garrison had done. Day 41. Dominion Command, reviewing 2 unexplained tunnel collapses in 6 weeks, made the reasonable tactical decision to abandon ground assault entirely and shift to orbital bombardment, the doctrine that had ended 5 of the previous 6 sieges within days of its adoption. The bombardment began at dawn and continued for 11 hours, targeting every surface structure large enough to register on Dominion sensors as a potential garrison position. It destroyed a great deal. By the time it ended, most of Kyth's surface architecture, administrative buildings, housing blocks, the mining authorities' own offices no longer existed in any recognizable form. What the bombardment did not destroy was the garrison itself, because by day 41, colony miners working double shifts under Voss's direction had already relocated 80% of remaining personnel into the tunnel network. Into spaces the miners themselves had spent decades excavating for reasons that had nothing to do with war and everything to do with silicate deposits. The Dominion had bombed a city. The garrison had by then mostly stopped living in it. Day 67. Kessa requested, through Concord's formal channels, permission to intervene directly on the garrison's behalf, a request outside her mandate, outside Concord policy, and outside anything a liaison officer had done in the previous 6 engagements. Concord Command denied the request within hours, citing neutrality doctrine in language that had not changed in over a century. Kessa's log entry from that day, recovered afterward, noted only that the request had been submitted and declined. It was, by later Concord historical review, the first documented instance of any Kyth's liaison officer attempting to step outside strict observation. Voss, unaware that any such request had been made or denied, spent day 67 exactly as she had spent most days by then, walking sections of tunnel with a headlamp and a notebook, marking structural points, working alongside colony engineers who had by this stage largely stopped asking what the markings were for. Day 89. Warlord Threx Dahl, commanding the Dominion fleet in the system, broadcast an open channel offer of surrender terms directly to the colony, the first such offer issued anywhere in the 11-month campaign. Dominion doctrine did not typically extend surrender terms. Erasure did not require the enemy's cooperation. That Threx Dahl offered them at all suggested, to Concord analysts reviewing the transmission afterward, that something about the engagement had already begun to depart from doctrine in ways that made even limited negotiation preferable to continued unpredictability. The offer was not answered. No formal reply was transmitted in either direction. Voss's personal log for that day, recovered from garrison archives, contained one line, tunnels holding, continuing, day 118. The garrison executed its most ambitious action of the siege, a coordinated strike using charges positioned across 4 separate tunnel access points, each rigged over the course of nearly 3 months, without Voss disclosing the full scope of the plan to Colonel Anand or anyone else in the chain of command. The strike destroyed 2 Dominion orbital drop platforms simultaneously, structures the Dominion had believed sufficiently secure to require no additional ground defense. When Colonel Anand discovered, in the strike's aftermath, exactly how much of the tunnel network had been quietly repurposed over 3 months without her full knowledge, her recorded response was a long silence, followed by an order to reinforce whatever tunnel points remained. She did not discipline Voss. She did not ask her to explain herself further. The tunnels were working, and by day 118 that had become its own kind of authority, day 142. Warlord Threx Dahl's flagship altered its orbital pattern for the first time in the entire campaign, shifting from an aggressive forward posture to something closer to a defensive holding pattern. Kessa's log entry that day read, reassessing prior estimate. By this point in the siege, the Dominion fleet had sustained greater cumulative losses at Kyth's Hold than across the previous 6 campaigns combined, not from any single engagement, but from 133 days of small, procedural, individually survivable losses that had never stopped accumulating. Threx Dahl was not, by any Dominion record recovered afterward, humiliated by this. He was recalculating, in the specific way a commander recalculates when the terrain itself has stopped behaving the way established doctrine said it would. Day 151. With the fleet in defensive posture and ground assault effectively abandoned, Threx Dahl ordered a full sensor sweep of the colony's subsurface, attempting for the first time to map the tunnel network directly rather than infer its extent from where charges kept originating. The sweep took 6 days to complete and returned a result that Dominion engineering staff flagged, in language unusually direct for a Dominion technical report, as incomplete and possibly compromised. The network was larger and less regular than anything in the sweep data could fully resolve, because it had never been built according to any military logic. It had been built over decades by miners solving ore extraction problems, and Voss had spent 5 months learning its irregularities rather than fighting them. Day 158. A final Dominion ground team, small and lightly equipped, attempted a targeted infiltration of what sensor data suggested was a primary tunnel junction, hoping to seed a countercharge before the garrison could react. The team entered a passage that colony miners had nicknamed, decades earlier and for reasons unrelated to the war, the Long Gallery. Voss met them there, not with an ambush, Colonel Annan's later report was careful to note, but because she had been walking that section on her ordinary rounds when the team's entry tripped a sensor she had installed herself 3 months prior. The engagement lasted under 4 minutes. It ended with the tunnel's own geometry doing most of the work, a narrow chokepoint Voss had mapped on her first week in the colony and never once needed until that day. No garrison casualties were recorded. The Dominion team did not complete its objective, and no further infiltration attempts were logged for the remainder of the siege. On day 163, the Dominion fleet withdrew from the Kythe's hold system. No formal surrender was issued by either side. No formal victory was declared by the garrison. The withdrawal order, intercepted by conquered monitoring equipment still in high orbit, carried a single transmitted line from Threxdal to Dominion High Command. The tunnels were the terrain. We fought the wrong war. Oren Kessa found Sergeant Voss 2 days later, at the mouth of the tunnel that had held the longest, the same access shaft where the first collapse on day 9 had bought the garrison its first 4 days of unexpected quiet. The 11-day estimate, Kessa said, it was wrong by 152 days. It was a reasonable estimate, Voss said, based on the information available at the time. Kessa did not ask why Voss had never corrected it sooner in 161 days of opportunity to do so. She asked instead whether Voss had known on that second day that the 11-day estimate was wrong. No, Voss said. I knew the tunnels, I didn't know how long they'd hold. Nobody knows that in advance. You just keep them holding 1 day at a time until you stop having to. Kessa considered that for a moment, the particular stillness of someone filing a statement away for a report she had not yet decided how to write. Voss did not offer an explanation beyond that. She reached down and picked up her father's rifle sling from where it had rested coiled against the tunnel wall for the better part of 5 months. Carried through New Kolkata and never once attached to a weapon, carried again here for a reason she still had not explained to anyone and did not appear to feel any need to. She coiled it once more under her arm and walked toward the surface access ahead, without looking back at the tunnel mouth that had, over 5 months, become something closer to a monument than a defensive structure. Colonel Anand opened the garrison's campaign assessment record that evening, in an office that had, until day 41, been an administrative building, and was now a reinforced tunnel chamber with a desk in it. Under the field marked outcome, she considered several longer phrases, discarded each of them and wrote 3 words. Discarded each of them and wrote 3 words.